Greetings from the county line. We're back at the Grissom Air Museum this week with my close personal friend Tom Jennings and retired Air Force Colonel Tim Cahoon to talk about how Tom and the museum are working to preserve the Grissom legacy. And Tom, this week you got a lot going on down here in this exhibit hall, right?
We do, and we change it up every year. So it gives a new perspective, new objects. Some of the objects, like the big bomb behind me, will always remain on the floor for a couple of reasons. One, it's large. I don't have a big enough space to move it and store it, but also it's heavier than sin.
Yeah. Well, if you move it, it might go off.
Well, you know, this building is the only building in the world that survived a thermonuclear bomb.
Yes.
When they brought it in, they hit the doorway and they're still standing.
I heard it ticking.
What aircraft would have been used
B-47, B-58, and B-52s. Now, this one here, if you remember, is a lot more powerful than the two that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This bomb here, if it were to detonate where it's at right now, it could take everything out from South Bend to Indianapolis. Just kill everything. Pretty powerful.
Yeah, it's pretty frightening.
It is. And imagine there were several of these over here when they were stationed here with the 58s and the 47s. So, yeah.
I can't let you talk about nuclear bombs without reminding you about December 4th, 1962, I think. 64.
64 with Captain Cervantes.
Yeah, that was really unique because it was one of just a few broken arrow nuclear weapons accidents, and it happened right here in Indiana.
Correct. They were the first plane behind the 135 as it was.
Now, tell me that whole story.
Okay. Well, part of the alert when the klaxons and the sirens and everything went off, they would run to their planes. The 135 was the first plane up because as the B-58s would get in the air, they'd be topped off with fuel and take off to whatever destination they were going to. So there was a 135 that was queued up to take off, and then Rocky's aircraft was the first B-58 behind it. And as it was pulling on the runway, as the 135 was taking off, the theory is that the wash from the 135 engines pushed it across the ice. It had ruptured the fuel tank on the bottom of it on one of the light posts, and with it being electrified, just ignited the fuel and started burning all the fuel that was there. So the pilot was able to get off the nose. The DSO, or Defense Systems Operator, was able to get off the wing. Rocky, being in the bomb nav position in the middle, couldn't get to either or because the canopies were all up. So he was kind of stuck there. About a month or so before, a friend of his had burned up in a fire, and Rocky knew he didn't want to go that way.
In a airplane accident.
Correct.
Okay.
So he decided, well, he'd get in the ejection seat, take his chances with that, knowing that it wasn't designed to eject at a standstill because it didn't have the parachutes wouldn't be able to engage like that. It needed the airspeed of the Mach 2 or, pretty close to that for it to engage the parachutes. So it shot it up about 150 to 200 feet above the aircraft. It came down on its side. He ruptured his spleen and died. So he did die in that accident shortly thereafter. But the plane and the bomb, which was leaking, had caught on fire. They couldn't stop the leak from the thermonuclear weapon. So they buried everything. And they buried it on base. Several years later, when they built the prison, they dug everything up, cleaned up the soil, made sure there was no contaminated soil or anything there, and disposed of it properly.
So Rocky's bomber was the B-58 Hustler.
Yep.
Remained buried on this base for, what, 36 years before
Yeah. For the
it
prison
was
built.
exhumed.
Yep. Yep.
I'd heard that story, but I never really believed it.
Yeah, and there's nothing there that we've been able to find that said it never happened. But it's one of the things that we know that the Air Force was pretty big into burying planes. It happened with Dick Blakesley's plane when they had their accident in McKinney, Kentucky. They just buried everything right there on the spot.
Well, there wasn't much left of that airplane.
No, there
'Cause
wasn't.
he hit the ground
Upside down.
going like 1,000 miles an hour.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, they were moving, and their plane had inverted, so they couldn't eject out of their seats because it would have just pushed the ejection seats into the ground, killed them anyway. So he was trying to correct it and couldn't, and it just went right into the ground. And
You talked about Blakesley in one of our previous episodes, and you've just mentioned him again. So
Yeah.
tell us that story.
well, Dick Blakesley was a World War II pilot, B-47 pilot, and flew several other aircraft, and then got into the B-58 program. Because of his age, he became a trainer as well, as the older pilots were usually more for training the younger crew members. And they were doing a training exercise, low level, over McKinney, Kentucky. And his plane was based out of Bunker Hill, Grissom at the time. And as they were down in that area, there was a mechanical failure with the aircraft. We don't know exactly what the failure was because the report is still heavily redacted. But we do know there was a mechanical failure. Reports from eyewitnesses said the plane had flames coming out the engines. It was upside down flying in a downward trajectory. So that could have been gyroscope, I guess, or something like
Well,
that
that's
that causes
a flight control malfunction.
Yeah.
And it could be too that the pilot was fully engaged with looking inside at the gauges or whatever, trying to take action to remedy the problem. And as you're inside, you're making control inputs unintentionally. So he could have just been doing this and slowly pushing on the stick, diving, and at whether he ultimately ever really knew, or if they just, hell, he could have hit the ground. They could have all hit the ground just looking inside. We wouldn't know at this point. But so it could have been a flight control problem.
Did that ever happen to you?
Well, spatial disorientation can happen for a host of reasons. And I can think of one time very specifically where, I knew it and I was consciously fighting against it. And ultimately, thank God, I didn't crash or anything. But, it can happen at night. It can happen in the weather. It can just happen because you're focused on the wrong thing at the wrong time.
Right.
And then especially you're at low altitude, you have so little time to react and correct. So, and if there was a known problem, they wouldn't have been flying low altitude probably if the weather wasn't at least clear there. I don't know what the rules were. They had a radar on the B-58. They may have had the ability to fly at fairly low altitude on radar. The B-52 can do that. But odds are they were in the clear. I'm going to guess that at this point. But if there was a known malfunction, it's very easy to get tunnel vision on what's going on, what's wrong with these problems here. I'm flipping switches, I'm reading different gauges. Hell, he's looking at his checklist. And now, granted, there's two other people. I don't know if the two backseaters also had an attitude indicator. And as you look, they have very small windows, so it's not easy to tell, am I level and upright?
Right.
So they may not have been able to say, holy crap, pull up, roll out. I don't know.
Yeah.
But you just don't have a lot of time to react, period, when you're at low altitude. That's the bottom line.
Correct.
For whatever the issue is. So.
Yeah. Well, I know the plane itself was best designed to fly between 50,000 and 70,000 feet. But if I understand correctly, Tom, correct me, that it was General LeMay and McNamara said that the aircraft should fly under 50,000 feet. They didn't want them flying that high for whatever reason. And talking with some of the other pilots and crew members, that aircraft, some Navy pilots would say, well, we would fly, below 500 feet, for 15, 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes. And I've heard the B-58 guys say, hell, we did that for 5 hours at a clip.
Well, when the B-58, that approximate 10 years that it was in operational service, that period began not somewhere around the time that Gary Powers was shot down in his U-2 over the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And that was the first real eye-opener that the Soviets had surface-to-air missiles that could shoot down high-altitude targets.
Okay.
The B-52 originally was supposed to go high. The B-47, ideally was going to fly high. But at that point, somebody decided you at least need to practice going in low because you're too vulnerable up high.
Gotcha.
You're going to, at some point, you'll go low because they won't be able to see on radar before you get to the target. Now, if your target is deep in the Soviet Union, there's air defenses all the way from the coast of the Soviet Union to the target. So the idea that they may have practiced flying for hours at low altitude could have been because the scenario was, look, you're going to cross the coast, you're going to drop down because between there and Moscow or God knows where, you don't want them to see you on radar.
Right.
And so they were practicing that, if not for 30 minutes or multiple hours, to be able to do that if they had to do that for real, is what I'm guessing.
The B-52 has some sort of terrain avoidance radar. I mean, I think a lot of probably warplanes do today.
Now,
were those available back in Dick Blakesley's day?
I don't think it was. I say this. I don't know enough about the B-52 connecting the radar to the autopilot. They like the B-52 could generate a display of the terrain at a certain distance in front of you, and then there could be symbology to, as long as that crosshair is above that squiggly line that represents the terrain at 5 miles, you're going to miss the terrain. In the era of the B-58, I don't think they were quite there yet. Even what I'm describing, I think that was like a B-52H model thing. I have one ride in a B-52 long after it was first flown in the H model, which is what we still have today, the H models. So I don't know that the B-58s was that sophisticated. My guess is there was a lot of manual stuff. It might have been able to have shown him a line. Then again, the nav guy may have been just saying, okay, fly this out, climb, descend, control the cursor for the pilot to fly. I just don't know enough about the B-58.
How scary would that be? Careening across the Kentucky landscape at 1,000 miles an hour at what was their altitude? They knew what their altitude was. It was just a few hundred feet.
Typically you're going to fly at 500 feet for something like that. The F-111, which was designed in the 60s and first flew operationally tests in Vietnam mid-late 60s, was one of its big things was it was one of the first, at least well known, to have autopilot radar, the whole radar, so they could fly night low levels in it. And they ran into a lot of mountains with the F-111. So that's why I'm thinking the B-58 probably didn't have that yet, The B-52s probably didn't have it at that point, if they have that full-up model capability now. There's a lot of map
and
reading.
it's really heartwarming. It's not creepy. I heard about the Blakesley accident. Involved his marriage.
Okay.
He this was a horrendous crash. I mean, people thought a gas line had exploded because there was nothing there was this huge fireball, an explosion. People came running out there to see what had happened, and there was just a trench that was on fire. And they thought, that's all they found.
Yeah.
So they summoned Air Force officials to come in and investigate, and they, found nothing but bits and pieces, really, except for a really burned wallet.
Yep.
And it was found kind of close to where they thought, I think the navigator's canopy had landed, so they assumed it was his. They take this wallet, and the only thing, all the identification, money, everything else was burned up in it, except for a picture of a woman that was scorched. And they take this picture to the navigator's, or whichever crew member it was, family, and said, well, this is all we got. And we don't know, that's nobody we know. I think that's Dick's wife. So the only thing to survive that entire crash was this picture of his wife that he insisted on carrying with him every time he got in that airplane.
Yeah.
Wow. That's...
I know, it gives me chills.
Twilight Zone stuff.
About it right now.
And that picture is on display in the Blakesley exhibit case. And so we share that with visitors. And
made a copy of it, or the actual
that's
one?
the actual one.
Wow.
Yeah. And
my gosh.
When we tell that story to people, some people have tears in their eyes. It's something that really, like you say, goosebumps, teary-eyed, whatever you want to say. But it's very touching, and in that, you have people then start talking about, a relative that they know that died in an accident or served in the war or in the military and whatnot, and then they start sharing their stories and stuff, and it's just incredible.
Isn't that what makes your museum important and maybe even unique? Because a lot of these military museums focus on the hardware, and they tell stories of battles. But you're telling stories about people and families who made sacrifices in defense of our country.
Exactly.
Stories like that bring tears to people's eyes.
It does, and I've said this often before to our guests and a lot of people. The objects, the planes, the exhibits that we have are really cool. They're really neat stuff. But it's the stories that you connect to the individuals that worked with them or flew the planes or was part of the mission. That's the thing that's really important. And that's what I think connects our visitors to whatever object that we have, because we've connected it to an individual. And then they start thinking about their family member that served. We have an exhibit that right now is off display, but it'll be back again next year. And it's a real simple display. And at first I just did it because I didn't know what else to do with it. But we have a set of about 15 mailboxes that's near our staircase, near the entrance of the Tuskegee display. And in that, we copied letters, we copied postcards, we took part of journals and transcribed them and made them look like a letter from home. So it was that pilot or that crew member or that service member that was writing to home, or someone from home was writing to that individual. And I tell you, that's a very popular display. People really connect and gravitate to that display case. It's just something else to see that story from an actual person to a service member or vice versa. You can't beat it. I mean, it's just great.
No.
As fewer and fewer people in our population have direct connection with the armed forces, it's important, I think, to do those kind of things and remind them that there are people sacrificing for our way of life every day, and it's not just them.
Yeah.
It's
the
woman in the picture,
the family members,
exactly,
the wives,
Tim.
the children,
family members,
the parents,
have to
brothers,
sit
sisters.
at home and find other jobs and maybe move back in with their parents while they're raising their kids, or their husbands or wives or somebody is, off in a far off land, trying to preserve freedom somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really, and that you're telling those stories, I think, is key.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And I want to add too, that just because I always think it's important, and you mentioned it earlier about the B-58 crew chief, but that and you mentioned it also, often we focus on the hardware, and we've talked about the families, but that there's millions of other men and women who make it all happen. The crew chief, the guy the air policeman, security police now, who guard the weapon storage areas, the mechanics, the guy in the warehouse, the cook. And I'm going to tell this story real quick. I went to a honor flight thing where they take the veterans to Washington, D.C. And I went to the pre-gathering, and I was going around talking to veterans. What did you do? And almost to a man, they kept saying, well, I was just a cook. I didn't go to Vietnam. I just had to go to Germany. And they were embarrassed that they weren't at the pointy end of the stick. And I got up because I was scheduled to
You must
speak.
not have been talking to anybody who was in the Marine Corps, because they're always...
Well, regardless, my point being is I got up and because I was stunned by that. And it's like, I'm going to give you all an order. Stop saying I was just. That doesn't matter. Every one of you is critical. And the mission cannot happen without all of you. The mechanic, that B-58 never flew without that crew chief launching it. Hence his love affair with it.
Yeah.
His job was as critical as the pilot's. We don't see that often.
Right.
And it's good, you've mentioned it in your displays, you talk about it. So you've got the family support, you've got all that other support to make it happen. And it's just so important, but the public doesn't often see that. And it's neat that you emphasize both pieces of that here.
Yeah, and thank you for recognizing that. I think that's important. And, like you say, people say, I was just this or I was just that. Well, like the saying goes in the tanker world, can't kick ass without tanker gas.
Absolutely.
That's important. You got your crew chiefs and your maintainers. That plane's not going to get off the ground if it's not in good shape and it's not cared for.
Yeah.
So that pilot, and speaking of that, one thing I found when we started with the Tuskegee Airmen exhibit, there's a lot of people out there that never realized they were Tuskegee Airmen because they weren't pilots. They were maintainers or they were ground crew or something else like that.
Same thing. It took all of them
to
make it happen.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
Yeah, that's a
easily
good point.
forgotten.
Yeah.
So,
Well, listen, we're out of time this week, but these guys, retired Air Force Colonel Tim Cahoon, call sign Kaboom, and Tom Jennings, the director of the Grissom Air Museum, have agreed to come back next week to tell us a little more, not only about the history of the base, but also about what's going on at the museum. So until then, God bless.